It was something weird. It wasn't Viagra. It was something new that came up because they were going through the era of the steroids.
From the Honky Tonk Man to Ken Patera, wrestling legends have long questioned the official story behind Rick Rude's death. Even stranger, alleged footage and sightings surfaced afterward. In this video, we break down the mystery and the moments Rick Rude was supposedly caught on camera after his death. Let's start with the Honky Tonk Man. If there's one name that comes up more than any other when discussing the rumors surrounding Rick Rude's death, it's Wayne Ferris, better known to wrestling fans around the world as the Honky Tonk Man. The former Intercontinental Champion, the man who held that prestigious title for a record-setting 454 days, has never been one to shy away from controversy or speaking his mind in shoot interviews. Throughout his post-wrestling career, Honky has built a reputation for being brutally honest, some would say too honest, about the inner workings of the wrestling business and the personal lives of his colleagues. And when it comes to Rick Rude, boy oh boy, has the Honky Tonk Man had plenty to say over the years. In various interviews conducted throughout the years, most notably in a 2015 appearance on Hannibal TV that sent shockwaves through the wrestling community, Honky Tonk Man has put forward what can only be described as the most extreme and sensational version of events surrounding Rude's passing. According to his account, which he has repeated multiple times across different platforms and interview settings with remarkable consistency, Rick Rude was suffering from erectile dysfunction, a condition that Honky attributes directly to Rude's extensive history of steroid use throughout his wrestling career. This wasn't just casual steroid use, according to Honky. This was years upon years of heavy abuse that had taken a devastating toll on Rude's body in ways that the public never saw. Now here's where the story takes a turn that quite frankly sounds like something straight out of a horror movie, and I need you to understand that I'm not making any of this up. This is what the Honky Tonk Man has claimed on camera for the world to see. He has stated that in order to combat these intimate health issues, Rick Rude resorted to injecting substances directly into his penis, a form of penile injection therapy. The Honky Tonk Man has referred to this as injectable Viagra, though as we'll explore later in this video, that terminology isn't exactly accurate from a medical standpoint. The actual treatment he's likely referring to is something called papaverine or alprostadil injection therapy, which is a legitimate medical procedure that doctors do prescribe for erectile dysfunction, but it carries significant risks when not administered properly under medical supervision. According to Honky's telling of events, something went terribly, horrifically wrong with these injections. He has claimed that Rude developed a severe infection as a result, one so serious that doctors allegedly informed him that amputation would be necessary. Think about that for a moment. Here was a man whose entire persona, whose entire gimmick in professional wrestling was built around being the most desirable, the most sexually appealing man in the business, the ravishing one, the man who would make women in the audience swoon and their boyfriends and husbands seethe with jealousy. And now, according to this account, he was facing the prospect of losing the very thing that defined his masculinity. The psychological devastation of receiving such news, Honky has argued, pushed Rick Rude into a deep depression that ultimately led to what he believes was an intentional overdose. In other words, suicide, not an accident as the official report stated. The implications of this claim are absolutely staggering when you really sit down and think about it. It's not just suggesting that the official cause of death was wrong, it's suggesting that there was a cover-up of sorts, or at the very least, a collective decision by those who knew the truth to spare the family and the public from the horrifying reality of what actually happened. Now I want to pause here and acknowledge something important that we need to address. The Honky Tonk Man's reputation in the wrestling community is, shall we say, complicated at best and controversial at worst. He's known for being outspoken to a fault, for having a memory that sometimes embellishes details to make stories more entertaining, and for not always having the warmest relationships with his fellow wrestlers, many of whom have publicly feuded with him over the years. Many in the wrestling community have dismissed these claims as unreliable hearsay and twisted rumor, the kind of locker room gossip that gets more outrageous with each telling. But regardless of whether you believe his account or not, there's absolutely no denying that his words have shaped the conversation around Rick Rude's death for over 2 decades now and continue to be discussed to this day. The ripple effects of Honky's claims have been immense and far-reaching. They've been discussed on countless wrestling forums from the early days of the internet to modern-day Reddit threads, debated in YouTube comment sections on virtually every Rick Rude tribute video, and have even spawned dedicated dedicated investigation videos from popular YouTubers like Justin Wang, who explored what he called the bizarre urban legend surrounding Rick Rude's death in a video that racked up hundreds of thousands of views. Whether true or false, the Honky Tonk Man's on-camera statements have become an inextricable part of Rick Rude's posthumous legacy, for better or for worse, and that's something that will likely never change. Ken Patera. Moving on to our second individual who went on camera to discuss Rick Rude's death, we come to a man whose credentials in the world of professional wrestling and legitimate athletic competition are absolutely beyond reproach. Ken Patera wasn't just a professional wrestler who could talk a good game. This man was an Olympic weightlifter who competed for the United States of America on the world stage and held multiple world records in his prime. We're talking about a genuine strongman, a world-class athlete whose strength wasn't just part of a wrestling gimmick but was the real deal, verified by international competition. He transitioned into professional wrestling and became a major star in his own right, headlining cards and feuding with the biggest names in the business. When Ken Patera speaks, people in the wrestling business tend to listen because this is a man who has earned respect through decades of competition at the highest levels imaginable. In a 2020 interview conducted by Hannibal TV, and we'll be talking more about Hannibal himself later in this video because he's become something of an investigative journalist for wrestling deaths, Ken Patera shared information that he claims came directly from someone who was extremely close to the Rude family and would have had inside knowledge of what was happening. That source? None other than Jim the Anvil Neidhart, who was Bret Hart's brother-in-law through marriage to Bret's sister Ellie, and a longtime veteran of the wrestling business who tragically passed away himself in 2018. Neidhart's connection to the wrestling family tree runs incredibly deep. He was part of the famous Hart wrestling dynasty by marriage, traveled with the Who's Who of professional wrestling for decades, and his word carried significant weight in industry circles because he was known as a straight shooter who didn't embellish stories. According to Patera's account of what Neidhart told him during their conversations, the situation with Rick Rude was even more dire and more psychologically devastating than what Honky Tonk Man had described in his interviews. Patera claimed that Neidhart relayed information suggesting that Rick Rude lost his mind when he learned about the extent of his health problems and the potential need for drastic medical intervention. The phrase "lost his mind" is particularly haunting and chilling because it suggests a man who had reached the absolute end of his rope, someone who was facing a reality so devastating and so incomprehensible that he couldn't cope with it mentally or emotionally. It paints a picture of complete psychological breakdown, of a man whose entire identity was being stripped away from him. Now, what's particularly interesting and worth examining about Ken Patera's contribution to this ongoing narrative is the chain of information and how it reached him. We're dealing with what researchers and journalists would call second-hand or even third-hand information here, which always needs to be viewed with appropriate skepticism. Patera is recounting what Neidhart allegedly told him, and Neidhart presumably got his information from somewhere else, possibly from the Rude family directly given his connections, or possibly from other sources within the tight-knit wrestling community where information travels fast. This game of telephone that happens in professional wrestling circles is something that historians and journalists who cover the industry have long grappled with and struggled to verify. Stories get passed from one wrestler to another in locker rooms, at conventions, at bars after shows, and details get added or subtracted along the way depending on who's telling the story and what they think makes for a better tale. By the time something reaches a shoot interview on YouTube, years or even decades after the fact, it's often incredibly difficult to separate fact from embellishment from outright fiction that someone convinced themselves was true. The wrestling locker room has always been a breeding ground for tall tales and exaggerated stories. It's part of the culture and the fabric of an industry built on larger-than-life characters and unbelievable storylines. These are professional storytellers after all. But here's the thing that gives Patera's account more weight than typical locker room gossip. Ken Patera didn't just share this information casually in a backstage conversation that someone overheard and repeated. He sat down in front of a camera, looked directly into the lens, and put these claims on the record for public consumption, where anyone in the world could see them. He attached his name and his hard-earned reputation to this account, knowing full well it would be preserved on the internet forever. And in the world of professional wrestling, where your reputation is quite literally everything you have, that decision carries significant weight. The addition of Patera's voice to the chorus of wrestlers discussing Rude's death added a layer of credibility that the rumors might not have otherwise had. After all, this wasn't just idle gossip from someone with a grudge or an axe to grind. This was a respected veteran of the business sharing sharing information he claimed came from someone within the wrestling family's inner circle. Whether that makes it definitively true is another matter entirely, but it certainly made more people sit up and take notice of what was being said. Jake the Snake Roberts. Now we arrive at someone whose connection to Rick Rude runs far deeper than just being contemporaries in the wrestling business or casual acquaintances who crossed paths at events. Jake the Snake Roberts and Rick Rude had one of the most memorable and genuinely heated feuds in WWF history during the late 1980s, a program that wrestling fans still talk about to this day as one of the greatest examples of storytelling the industry has ever produced. This wasn't just your standard wrestling angle cooked up by writers in a back room. This was personal, this was intense, and it blurred the lines between reality and kayfabe in ways that wrestling rarely had before or has since. When Jake Roberts speaks about Rick Rude, he's speaking about someone he spent months working opposite in the ring night after night, someone he traveled those endless miles on the road with, and someone he genuinely knew on a personal level beyond the characters they played on television. For those of you who might not be familiar with the history or who weren't watching wrestling during that golden era, let me paint the picture for you. The Rude-Roberts feud stemmed from an angle where Rick Rude would airbrush the face of Jake's wife, Cheryl Roberts, onto his wrestling tights, an act of provocation that was designed to generate maximum heat with the audience. This wasn't just any woman's face, this was the real wife of a wrestler being used as part of a storyline, which was extremely rare and controversial, even by the standards of that era. The storyline escalated dramatically when Rude kissed Cheryl on camera during a segment, and in one famous incident that became the stuff of wrestling legend, Cheryl actually slapped Rude so hard during a segment that it reportedly ruptured his eardrum. And that part wasn't scripted at all. It was a real slap delivered with real anger that had real consequences, and it shows just how emotionally charged that whole program became for everyone involved. Given this deep personal history between the two men, when Jake Roberts went on camera to discuss Rick Rude's death, people paid close attention to every word he said. Jake, like Honky Tonk Man, has suggested in interviews that Rude's passing may have been connected to depression stemming from health complications related to steroid use, including erectile dysfunction. Jake's perspective adds another important layer of confirmation to the narrative that was circulating in wrestling circles, lending credibility through the sheer number of people who were saying similar things. Though it's worth noting that Jake doesn't go into the same graphic detail that Honky Tonk Man did about specific medical procedures or potential amputation, preferring to speak more generally about the situation and the toll that the wrestling lifestyle takes on performers. What makes Jake's perspective particularly poignant and worth paying attention to is his own very public and well-documented battle with addiction and personal demons. If anyone in the wrestling business understands the dark side of the industry, the toll it takes on one's body and mind and spirit, it's Jake the Snake Roberts. He's lived it in ways that most people couldn't imagine. He survived it, barely at times, coming closer to death than anyone should have to. His story of recovery, documented in films like Beyond the Mat and the acclaimed documentary The Resurrection of Jake the Snake, has inspired countless people who have struggled with similar issues of addiction, depression, and self-destruction. Diamond Dallas Page's work helping Jake get clean and healthy became one of the most heartwarming stories in modern wrestling history. And so when Jake speaks about a fellow wrestler potentially succumbing to the pressures and health consequences of the profession, his words carry the weight of personal experience that no one can deny. He's not speaking theoretically or academically. He's speaking as someone who has been to the edge of that same abyss and somehow managed to pull himself back. Jake's contribution to the narrative around Rude's death is less about specific medical claims and more about painting a vivid picture of the environment that wrestlers of that era operated in on a daily basis. The constant travel that never seemed to end, the pressure to maintain a certain physique that audiences expected, the easy access to substances that could help you perform through pain or enhance your appearance. All of these factors created a perfect storm that claimed far too many lives far too young. When Jake the Snake Roberts sits down and reflects on Rick Rude, you're hearing from someone who competed against him at the highest level of the business, who understood the pressures he was under because he lived them himself, and who has the battle scars, both physical and emotional, to prove that he's not speaking from a place of ignorance or speculation. His perspective adds an emotional depth to the conversation that pure speculation simply cannot replicate, and it reminds us all that behind every wrestling character, behind every persona that we cheered or booed, is a human being dealing with very real struggles that don't disappear when the cameras stop rolling. Larry Zbyszko. Our fourth individual who went on camera to address the circumstances of Rick Rude's death brings a slightly different and perhaps more nuanced perspective to the table than what we've heard so far. Larry Zbyszko, the self-proclaimed living legend himself, has had a career in professional wrestling that spans multiple decades and encompasses virtually every role the business has to offer. He's been a wrestler who main evented cards, a commentator who called the action for millions of viewers, a booker who determined storylines behind the scenes, and just about everything else you can be in this business. He's worked alongside legends, he's created memorable moments that fans still remember fondly, and he's earned the respect of his peers through years of dedicated service to the industry he loves. And when he sat down to discuss Rick Rude in a YouTube interview that has since been widely circulated among wrestling fans, he offered what might be considered a more measured take on the situation, though it still raises some eyebrows and confirms that something was definitely not right with Rick Rude in those final days. In an interview that's still available on YouTube for anyone who wants to verify what I'm about to share with you, Larry Zbyszko was asked directly about the rumors surrounding Rick Rude's cause of death. His response is worth examining in detail because it represents both an acknowledgement that something was seriously wrong and a reluctance to fully commit to the more extreme versions of the story that others have told. Rather than just tell you what he said and have you take my word for it, I think it's important that you hear it from the man himself in his own words.
Yeah, it was something weird. It wasn't Viagra. It was something new that came up because they were going through the era of the steroids. And I never did steroids. I was 245, 50 pounds in my prime. And because I already had a name and, tons of heat, it wouldn't do me any good to take steroids. I waste money. I hate needles. And, I was already over, so why bother? And again, I hate needles and injecting. I never got a flu shot, never got the flu. But Rick was into a lot of steroid abuse. And there was something else. I can't remember the name of this product that came out because steroids were starting to get heat. In the old days, people really didn't pay much attention to it, but then it became illegal.
Human growth hormone, I think you might be thinking of. Because
maybe that's it, but I know that whatever it was that Rick Rude was, if you knew Rick, if it said take, 1 teaspoon, he'd drink half the bottle. Rick was a little out there. But yeah, he overdosed on something, but I really can't remember the name of that stuff.
What's absolutely fascinating about Zbyszko's account is the way he characterizes Rick Rude's personality and approach to life. That detail about Rude being the type of person who would drink half the bottle if the instructions said to take 1 teaspoon, that's the kind of insight that only someone who actually knew the man on a personal level could provide. You can't make that up. It paints a vivid picture of someone who perhaps pushed boundaries in all aspects of his life, not just in the wrestling ring where pushing boundaries was his job. Someone who didn't do anything halfway, who went all in on everything he did. Whether that's a positive or negative trait depends entirely on the context, but in the context of substance use and medication, it's obviously deeply concerning and potentially dangerous. Zbyszko's admission that he can't remember the name of that stuff is actually quite refreshing in its honesty, especially compared to others who have made very specific and detailed claims about exactly what happened. Unlike those who have stated with absolute certainty what medications were involved and what procedures were performed, Larry acknowledges the limitations of his knowledge and his memory. He knows something was wrong. He knows Rick had significant issues with substance abuse, but he's not willing to fabricate details he doesn't actually remember just to make for a more compelling interview. This kind of nuanced and honest testimony is valuable precisely because it doesn't fit neatly into either the official story camp or the conspiracy theory camp. Zbyszko confirms that Rick Rude had serious issues, but stops short of endorsing the most extreme rumors about amputation and suicide. It's the kind of middle ground perspective that often gets lost when people are looking for simple, sensational narratives that are easy to digest and share. The truth, as is often the case in matters like this, appears to be more complicated than either extreme would have us believe. Hannibal. Now we come to perhaps the most detailed and forensic examination of Rick Rude's death that has ever been presented on camera to the public. Devin Nicholson, better known in wrestling circles as Hannibal, has made a name for himself not just as a wrestler and promoter who has worked with major names in the industry, but as someone who investigates the deaths and controversies surrounding the wrestling business through his Hannibal TV platform on YouTube. His channel has become a go-to destination for shoot interviews where wrestlers speak candidly about their experiences, as well as deep dives into wrestling's most controversial topics that mainstream media won't touch. His examination of Rick Rude's death is no exception to his thorough approach. What sets Hannibal apart from the other individuals we've discussed so far is that he claims to have actually obtained and reviewed official documentation related to Rick Rude's death. Not just hearsay or secondhand accounts, but actual paperwork from the investigation. In a video on his channel that has been viewed tens of thousands of times, Hannibal states that someone randomly sent him the police reports and autopsy report related to Rick Rude's passing. He went on to review this documentation on camera in real time, providing what he presented as actual medical findings from the case that had never been publicly discussed before.
This is Hannibal here from the HannibalTV.com. One of my favorite wrestlers of all time is WWE Hall of Famer Rick Rude, and he certainly died far too young, around the age of 40. There's a lot of mystery related to his death, and somebody randomly sent me the police report and autopsy report related to his death because many wrestlers, including the Honky Tonk Man, Ken Patera, the Berserker, Hacksaw Jim Duggan, and Jake the Snake, have alluded that it may have been an intentional overdose due to some issue with his penis that stemmed from some type of penile injection therapy gone wrong. Now,
according to Hannibal's detailed review of the autopsy documentation on camera, the medical examiner noted some significant findings regarding the condition of Rude's body that seemed to lend credibility to at least some of the rumors that had been circulating. He reports that the autopsy described the genitalia are those of a circumcised adult male. There's a 1/2 by 3 inch scar over the dorsal distal shaft of the penis. Just distal to the scar is another scar that extends from the 9 to 3 o'clock position through the 12 o'clock position. The fibrotic tissue is palpable in the left shaft of the penis. There is diffuse scarring at the base of the penis. Additionally, Hannibal notes that the testes were described as atrophic, which means shrunken, a condition commonly associated with long-term steroid use and one that can significantly affect hormonal balance and sexual function. Hannibal also reports that the police documentation mentioned empty bottles of Endocet, which contains oxycodone, a powerful opioid, Ambien, a sleep medication, and Amoxil, an antibiotic, found around Rude's body. This combination of a potent opioid painkiller, a sleep medication, and an antibiotic paints a troubling picture of someone who was dealing with multiple serious health issues simultaneously: chronic pain management, sleep problems that required medication, and some form of infection that required antibiotic treatment. The presence of the antibiotic is particularly interesting given the claims about infections that other wrestlers had made.
he had some severe physical issues that it looked like WWE and WCW weren't going to take the liability of signing him to a wrestling contract. Due to that, he seemed to have a great family. His son just did an interview with Jack Kilby on the Great North Wrestling Podcast. The link to that is in the description.
What Hannibal's video accomplishes, whether you believe his interpretation of the documents or not, is providing a bridge between the wild rumors that have circulated for years and some kind of documented evidence that can be examined and analyzed. The scarring described in the autopsy, if the documents are accurate and authentic, would at least partially corroborate the claims that Rick Rude had undergone some kind of medical procedures or injections in that area of his body. It suggests that the stories weren't entirely fabricated out of thin air. However, as Hannibal himself acknowledges in his video, having evidence of scarring is not the same as having definitive proof of the specific procedures or their outcomes that other wrestlers have claimed. The documentation, as he presents it, shows that something happened, but the leap from scarring to infection to amputation recommendation to suicide is still a significant one that relies on testimony from individuals who may or may not have direct knowledge of the actual situation and its full context. Bruce Pritchard. And finally, we come to perhaps the most authoritative voice to weigh in on the Rick Rude controversy, Bruce Pritchard. For those unfamiliar with Pritchard's role in wrestling history, this man has been a WWE insider for decades, going back to the 1980s when the company was transforming into a national powerhouse. He's been a manager who appeared on television as Brother Love, a producer who helped put together the shows we watched, a creative force who shaped storylines that defined eras, and most importantly for our purposes today, he's been someone with access to information that most outsiders simply don't have and never will. When Bruce Pritchard speaks about WWE history, he's doing so from a position of genuine insider knowledge and first-hand experience that few people on this planet can match. On his popular podcast, Something to Wrestle With, which has become one of the most successful and respected wrestling podcasts in the entire industry with millions of downloads, Bruce Pritchard addressed the rumors surrounding Rick Rude's death head-on without any hesitation. His response was about as definitive a denial as you're ever going to get in the wrestling business. And let's be honest, this is a business not exactly known for its transparency or giving straight answers to difficult questions. Pritchard called the suicide and amputation claims extremely silly and stated that he had actually spoken directly with Rick Rude's widow, Michelle, after Rude's passing. According to Pritchard, Michelle confirmed that her husband's death was an accidental overdose related to medications he was taking for pain management, including prescriptions related to a recent car accident that had exacerbated his existing injuries from his long wrestling career. This was a man dealing with chronic pain from years of punishment in the ring, who was taking medication to cope and who tragically took too much, nothing more and nothing less. This is significant for several important reasons that deserve consideration. First, Pritchard is claiming direct contact with a member of Rick Rude's immediate family, not a friend of a friend who heard something at a convention, not a fellow wrestler who heard something backstage through the grapevine, but the man's actual widow who was there when it happened, the person who was there in the house, who found him, who lived with him through whatever health struggles he was facing in those final months. If anyone on this earth knows the truth about what actually happened to Rick Rude, it would be Michelle. Second, Pritchard has a professional reputation to protect that he's built over decades. As someone who continues to work in the wrestling business at a high level to this day, making false claims about a deceased colleague's family would be a serious reputational risk that could cost him everything he's built. Pritchard emphasized that there was no evidence supporting the claims of suicide or intentional harm, and that the rumors had caused unnecessary pain to Rudy's surviving family members who had to hear these stories repeated over and over again. He characterized the more extreme stories as exactly the kind of gossip that flourishes in wrestling locker rooms. Stories that get bigger and more outrageous each time they're told around a new group of people, until they bear little resemblance to the original truth that sparked them. But here's the thing that makes this whole situation so complicated and prevents us from simply accepting Pritchard's word as the final answer. Bruce Pritchard is also a company man through and through. He spent his entire career protecting the interests of WWE and its performers, and that's literally been his job. Some in the wrestling community have questioned whether his denial is based purely on the facts as he knows them, or whether it's also influenced by a desire to protect the legacy of a WWE Hall of Famer and spare the company any association with the more salacious and embarrassing aspects of the story. It's a fair question that deserves to be asked, even if we can't definitively answer it. Regardless of where you fall on that question, Pritchard's on-camera statements represent the closest thing to an official response from the wrestling establishment that we have. When the WWE's own Bruce Pritchard dismisses the rumors as baseless after claiming to have spoken with Rude's widow, that carries weight that the speculation of other wrestlers simply cannot match. That brings us to the end of this video. For more interesting videos like this, click on the cards on your screen.